Imagine a man so ambitious, so dangerously confident, that he believed he could walk into the most secure fortress in England, and walk out wearing the crown of a king. Not metaphorically, literally. A real crown. A real heist. A real moment when the symbols of royal power slipped into the hands of a man history tried to forget. And here's the part nobody expects. He wasn't a master thief. He wasn't a noble hero. He wasn't even particularly loyal to anyone but himself. He was a disgraced officer with nothing left to lose and one burning desire to strike at the monarchy that had taken everything from him. A man who sold his own sense of honor for one night of power. Before we dive into how one of the boldest crimes in British history unfolded, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the History Sage. Stories like this aren't just tales from the past. They're warnings about how far a single human being will go when pride, revenge, and desperation collide. Thomas Blood entered the world in comfort, raised in a prosperous Protestant family that expected him to live a respectable life. But some people are born with a spark that refuses to remain ordinary. Blood was one of them. When England erupted into civil war, he crossed the sea and joined the Royalists only to switch sides later when it became convenient. That was the first clue to who he truly was, a man who followed opportunity, not loyalty. Some called him a traitor. Others thought he was a survivor, but Blood saw himself differently. He believed he deserved more status, more wealth, more power than the world had ever given him. So when Oliver Cromwell rewarded him with land and influence, Blood thought his future was secure. In his mind, it was only the beginning of the greatness he believed was promised to him. But the universe had a twisted sense of humor. When the monarchy returned in 1660, everything Cromwell had given him evaporated. Blood's land was taken, his wealth disappeared. His name became worthless. And as he watched everything he'd built crumble, something in him snapped. Humiliation is a powerful fuel, and in Thomas's blood, it lit a fire that would burn for decades. He didn't want forgiveness. He didn't want justice. He wanted revenge on the crown that had stripped him of his identity, his honor, and his future. That's when he turned to the shadows. Blood became a master of disguise, slipping between identities with the ease of an actor switching costumes backstage. Doctor, scholar, priest, loyal servant, rebel conspirator. You never knew who he was because he rarely stayed the same person twice. He plotted to capture Dublin Castle. He attempted twice to kidnap the Duke of Ormond, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Each scheme was more reckless than the last, fueled less by strategy and more by the intoxicating thrill of challenging the monarchy he despised. But none of these plots satisfied him. None of them made the crown tremble. None of them delivered the humiliation he craved, and then he saw it. The one thing that represented everything he had lost, everything he deserved, and everything he wanted to destroy. The crown jewels, the physical embodiment of power, treasure no one dared touch. The glittering heart of royal authority. Stealing them wouldn't just be a crime, it would be a declaration. It would be Thomas's blood announcing to the world that he could take from a king what had once been taken from him. Back in 1671, the Tower of London wasn't the impenetrable stronghold it is today. There were guards, yes, but not enough. There were locks, yes, but nothing formidable. The jewels themselves. They weren't sealed behind bulletproof glass. They weren't watched by cameras. They weren't surrounded by advanced security systems. They were protected by one man, gentle, aging veteran named Talbot Edwards, 77 years old, living in a modest apartment above the treasure he guarded. A man trusted because he was loyal, not because he was dangerous. And Blood saw him as the perfect doorway. He arrived at the tower, dressed as a soft-spoken clergyman, humble, friendly, completely harmless. He asked to see the jewels. He paid the small fee. He complimented Edwards, charmed him, he studied him, and most importantly, he returned. This time with a wife. Halfway through the visit, the woman collapsed with a violent stomach pain. Edwards and his wife rushed to help, guiding her upstairs, offering water, comforting her, while Blood watched silently and memorized every corner of the room. Days later, he returned with a thank-you gift for pairs of white gloves. Such a gentle, harmless gesture. Such an innocent expression of gratitude. Edwards let him in again. And again. Soon the clergyman and his wife were regular visitors, welcomed like old friends. And that's when Blood made his final move. He suggested that his wealthy nephew meet Edward's daughter, a potential marriage, a union between a respectable family and a rich young man. Edwards was thrilled. It was an honor he hadn't even dreamed of. But the moment he agreed to the introduction, his fate was sealed. Blood now had everything he needed: trust, access, a reason to return without suspicion, and a plan. What Edwards didn't know, what no one knew, was that the nephew was a lie, the marriage was a lie, the friendship was a lie, even the gentle parson was a lie. The only thing real was the intention behind every smile Blood had given him. He was coming for the crown. On the morning of May 9, 1671, Thomas Blood arrived at the Tower of London with the confidence of a man walking into his own home. Beside him stood the young nephew he had promised a tall, polite stranger with an expensive coat and the kind of well-rehearsed smile that made him look like a perfect suitor. In reality, he wasn't wealthy, noble, or even remotely respectable. He was Blood's own son, a wanted highwayman who had reinvented himself more times than most men changed shoes. With them came to more men friends of the nephew. At least that's what Edwards believed. In truth, they were members of Blood's criminal circle, each instructed to play a role in the most daring heist England had ever seen. One remained outside with the horses, maintaining the illusion of casual visitation. The other accompanied Blood inside, ready to move at the first signal. Mrs. Edwards, excited and flattered by the proposal of a wealthy suitor for her daughter, had prepared a meal. She welcomed them warmly, never once sensing the quiet storm about to explode inside her home. When the food wasn't quite ready, Blood smiled gently and suggested that Talbot Edwards take the young men downstairs for a private viewing of the crown jewels. Little preview, he said kindly. Something impressive for the future groom, and Edwards, believing he was honoring a potential family alliance, agreed without hesitation. With the simplicity of a man who had done this countless times, Edwards fetched the keys and led Blood, his son, and Captain Robert Perrott down the narrow stairs into the basement vault. Above them, another member of the gang positioned himself at the top of the staircase, quiet, still alert. The air tightened. The walls seemed to hold their breath. The moment the door opened, the world snapped. Blood struck first fast, sharp, brutal, bringing a mallet down on the old man's skull. Edwards staggered, shocked, but before he could scream, a blade sank into his side. They gagged him, tied him, and dragged him across the cold stone floor. Blood worked with the calm efficiency of someone who had practiced every step in his head a dozen times. Every second mattered. Every move had been rehearsed. They tore open the iron grill, protecting the treasure, and reached for the crown, the same crown Charles II wore at his coronation, newly forged after the monarchy's restoration. Blood slammed the mallet onto the royal crown, flattening its arch so it could be hidden under a cloak. The sound echoed through the vault like a hammer striking the bones of England itself. Next came the Orba golden sphere, studded with diamonds and pearls. Heavy, solid, unmistakable. Blood looked at it for only a second before shoving it down the front of his breeches. It was absurd. It was reckless. It was working. His son grabbed one of the royal scepters and tried to saw it in half, but the metal refused to yield. Sweat built on his brow. Time was slipping away. They could hear footsteps upstairs, voices, the building coming alive. Every second invited disaster, and then disaster arrived. Talbot Edwards' son, Wythe, had chosen this precise day, this precise morning to return home unexpectedly from military service. Fresh from Flanders, tired but eager to see his parents, he stepped into the corridor just in time to notice the door of the vault standing open. He paused, he frowned. Then he took a step closer. At that same moment, the lookout shouted a warning, a single desperate cry that shattered the basement silence. Edwards, battered but conscious, somehow forced his gag free and screamed words that cut through stone. Murder. Treason. The cry ripped upward through the tower like lightning. Blood froze. For the first time, his perfect plan trembled. He grabbed what he could and bolted. The scepter slipped from his son's hands. Jewels clattered across the floor. While Edwards saw the distorted crown, the stolen treasures, the blood on the floor, and his world shattered in an instant. The thieves lunged past him, exploding up the stairs, trampling through the corridor as yeoman warders sprinted after them. Blood and his men fired pistols wildly behind them, wounding one guard and scattering others. The chase tore through the tower grounds, boots striking stone, shouts ricocheting off ancient walls, panic spreading like wildfire. They reached the outside gate just as Captain Martin Beckman, head of the day's watch, joined the pursuit. Blood aimed his pistol and fired, missing his chest by inches. Beckman charged anyway, tackling him with the force of a battering ram. At that same moment, Blood's son attempted his escape on horseback only to slam directly into the pole of a passing cart. He flew off the saddle, crashing violently onto the ground as the other surviving members of the gang fled across the river. Back at the gate, Thomas's Blood was pinned, breathless, disarmed, and yet smiling. He looked up at Captain Beckman and laughed a soft, almost cheerful sound and said, "It was a gallant attempt, but it was for a crown." Even then, he wasn't afraid. Even then, he wasn't ashamed. Even then, he wasn't done, because what he said next changed, not just his fate, but the fate of every man in England who ever dreamed of defying a king. "I will answer to no one but His Majesty himself." And somehow, the king agreed. When King Charles II heard that the infamous Thomas Blood demanded to speak to him personally, the court expected the king to laugh, refuse, or order an immediate execution. But Charles was not like other kings. He enjoyed unpredictability. He admired boldness, even when it came wrapped in treason. And deep down, he understood something about men like Blood. Dangerous ambition recognizes itself. So instead of sending Blood to the gallows, the king summoned him. Blood was dragged into Whitehall Palace, bruised, filthy, and still handcuffed. The guards who escorted him expected him to tremble, to break, to beg, to dead. Instead, he walked as if he'd been invited to dinner. King Charles stood waiting, joined by his brother, the Duke of York, and his cousin, Prince Rupert Men, who carried the weight of the monarchy on their shoulders. Soldiers, nobles, and attendants filled the chamber, eager to witness the interrogation of the only man foolish enough to steal a royal crown. Charles studied Blood with quiet amusement, as though he were inspecting a rare animal unexpectedly caught in a trap. "What if I should give you your life?" the king asked. Most men in Blood's position would have collapsed with relief. They would have cried, fallen to their knees, thanked God, but not Thomas Blood. He lifted his chin and replied with the confidence of a man negotiating, not pleading. "I would endeavor to deserve it, sire." The room froze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was a man offering a deal to a king. Something shifted in Charles at that moment. Historians still argue about what truly happened inside the king's mind. Some claim Charles feared Blood's network of supporters, rebels, parliamentarians, and disaffected soldiers who might rally behind him if he were executed. Others whispered that Blood had once been a government spy, a double agent whose secrets could embarrass the monarchy if exposed in court. And there was the third theory, one that made Charles smile. Thomas's Blood reminded him of himself, a risk-taker, a man who followed the thrill of danger like a compass. Whatever the reason, the impossible happened. Charles pardoned him. Not only that, he rewarded him. Blood was granted a generous estate in Ireland with a yearly income worth the modern equivalent of $100,000. The courtroom gasped. Nobles fumed. Guards exchanged looks of disbelief. A would-be assassin pardoned, a jewel thief rewarded, a traitor embraced by the king. It made no sense. And yet, it made perfect sense. Blood had played the game of power exactly the way Charles understood it, boldly, fearlessly, without apology. His son and Robert Perrott were also released without charges, their crimes erased with a royal wave. Overnight, Thomas Blood transformed from a hunted criminal into a familiar figure at court, someone nobles whispered about but dared not confront. He attended events, mingled with aristocrats, and walked the palace halls as though he belonged there. He had stolen a crown and gained a throne's favor. It was the greatest trick he ever pulled. And yet, while Blood basked in royal mercy, another man was recovering quietly inside the tower, the loyal keeper Talbot Edwards. The wounds he suffered nearly killed him. His family's trust had been shattered. Their home had been violated. Their lives changed forever. And Blood, he never apologized. Not once. Edwards returned to his duties after healing, guiding visitors through the tower and telling the story of the morning a false clergyman stole the jewels right out from under him. People gathered in awe to hear it. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others gasped at the violence. Edwards told it so often that the tower eventually considered the tale part of its official history. For 3 years, the old keeper continued his work until he passed away at 80, buried within the very fortress he had served so faithfully. But Thomas Blood, the man who nearly ended his life, continued to thrive. For a decade, he lingered in London's elite circles, a bold, mischievous figure who seemed immune to consequences. His surviving son joined the military and would later command artillery at one of the most important battles in European history. Blood himself walked freely, entertained guests, whispered in noble ears, and lived as though destiny itself had given him permission to misbehave. Some people are destroyed by failure. Blood, somehow, was energized by it. But fate always collects its debts, even from men who think they can outwit it. And Thomas Blood's final chapter was waiting patiently, sharpening its blade. For years, Thomas Blood walked through London like a man who had discovered a secret shield against consequences. He appeared at court functions, whispered into noble ears, and laughed with the very people whose power he had once tried to shatter. Admirers called him bold. Enemies called him poisonous. But the truth was simpler. He was a man who had cheated fate, and believed he could do it forever. But fate catches everyone eventually, even the boldest thief in British history. Blood's downfall began not with a sword or a pistol or a midnight escape, but with an insult, careless remark. A moment of arrogance so small that most witnesses forgot it instantly. He insulted the Duke of Buckingham. To insult a man like Buckingham was not bravery. It was suicide wrapped in ego. Buckingham sued him for £10,000, an amount so massive it could have destroyed 10 men. He won the case effortlessly. In Blood, he refused to pay. Some whispered he was planning another escape. Others believed he was quietly preparing a new identity, ready to vanish into the shadows once more. Some even claimed he had a final plan that would make the crown jewel heist look insignificant. But then something happened that no scheme, no disguise, no cleverness could outrun. Thomas's Blood collapsed. The man who had survived battles, betrayals, manhunts, and royal interrogation died quietly in August of 1680 at the age of 62. No heroics, no drama, just a sudden collapse and a final breath. Yet even in death, he refused to let go of the game. Rumors spread through London that Blood had faked his own death to avoid paying Buckingham. People whispered that he had slipped into the night under a new name, laughing as he disappeared for the last time. The authorities became so suspicious that they actually exhumed his body to make sure it was truly him. Even in the grave, the man could not be trusted. He was buried in the yard of St. Margaret's Church, a simple plot for a man who had tried to steal a crown. A man who had stood face to face with a king and walked away richer than before. A man who proved that history isn't shaped only by heroes and rulers, but by those strange, unpredictable figures who slip between the cracks and change everything when no one expects it. And what of the crown jewels? Today, more than 2 million people pass through the tower each year to see them, guarded by bomb-proof glass, military personnel, advanced surveillance, and layers of protection unimaginable in the 1600s. But tucked inside that security is a legend one true. Unbelievable story about the morning a disguised rogue nearly took them all. Thomas Blood remains the only man in history to have stolen the crown jewels from the Tower of London, not because he was the smartest, not because he was the strongest, but because he was willing to risk everything for a single moment of victory. And perhaps that's why his story still echoes today. Because deep down, we are all fascinated by the people who dare to reach where others never would have ended if their hands were. Reaching for a crown that didn't belong to them. If you've enjoyed this journey through a hidden corner of British history, make sure you subscribe to the History Sage. There are countless more stories, waiting stories of ambition, betrayal, courage, madness, and moments so shocking they feel impossible, till you discover they're real. And before you go, answer this one question in the comments. If you had lived in 1671, would you have seen Thomas Blood as a villain, or as a man bold enough to challenge the world? Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring the strange, dangerous, extraordinary stories that history tried to bury.